This program has been made possible by the generous support of these organizations at Stanford University: Office of the Provost, Institute for International Studies, School of Humanities and Sciences, and Ambassador and Mrs. L. W. Lane, Jr., Donald L. Lucas, the Russell Family Foundation, Ronald P. Spogli. International Environmental Politics was offered to students at Stanford University as part of the International Policy Studies program during Winter Quarter 2001.
Okay, so we're going to just have people go around today and we'll come up here and present. No sneering, it's going to be okay. Public speaking, it's a good thing to learn. So come up and just present for a few minutes. As I said in the email last night, what I'd like you to present is, what's the question that you're concerned with? Okay, what's the data or evidence you have about that's kind of helps you evaluate that question, and sort of just a little bit of the story of what you've learned. And this is all so that the rest of us can get some sense of what, there's been a lot of good work going on. All the papers are looking very good. I beat you up grade-wise a little bit this time just to kind of get your attention, okay? Don't worry, everybody's going to pass. It's going to be fine. So don't get yourself all freaked out about it. You're all going to do fine and dandy, but I want to try to give you a sense of the amount of work you still need to do. But I think a lot of you have really good stuff, so I'd like everybody to be able to learn from that. So who wants to go first? And please don't be shy. Let's just get up there and do it. And I have a few people I know who've already asked not to go today, so I will respect that. But unless I have volunteers, I'm just going to go around the room. So somebody want to volunteer first? Andy, you're volunteering? Eli, great, good. Yeah, it's helpful. This will help with the camera stuff, and the students in the other classes will get a sense of presenting.
Anyway.
And if you need the overhead, we can set that up for you. Okay.
All right. Basically, the question I was trying to look at is something a little different than I guess what most of the people are looking at. I wanted to look at NAFTA, and especially the side agreements, the environmental side agreements that they agreed upon, and see whether or not they've turned out to be what everyone hoped they were. Like, basically, they got put in there at the last minute so that the U.S. would sign it. Supposedly, all this good environmental stuff for everyone to be happy about, as compared to sort of GATT and WTO, which didn't really have any real environmental agreements in them. I mean, GATT had some stuff, but it was sort of like fuzzy. So basically, some of the stuff I looked at was fertilizer consumption in Mexico before and after, and pesticide imports in Mexico before and after. Some of the other stuff that I'm still trying to get some data on, but I really want to look at too, is pollution in the border areas, sort of hazardous waste, especially transportation, which has increased, like, I think the statistic I saw was like over 160%. But also a lot of the companies that deal with hazardous waste in those areas have also increased to deal with, like, the demand. Basically what I found, fertilizer consumption and pesticide consumption is, fertilizer consumption has pretty much stayed the same since 90 to 99. I believe it decreased in 95 to 96, but I believe that was mainly due to the peso crisis and, like, the devaluation of the peso in the end of 1995. Pesticide imports actually have, like, been increasing since 1990.
Imports from Mexico to the U.S. or the other way?
No, imports into Mexico of pesticides. And thus sort of using that as like pesticide consumption, which has actually been increasing a lot from 1990 up until 95 when like there was a peso crisis, and then it decreased and then continued increasing. Basically, from what it looked like to me, that the effect of NAFTA in general, you couldn't really see. It looked like it was increasing pretty much at the same rate. I also looked at fertilizer consumption and pesticide consumption in some other Latin American countries and South American countries, Chile, Costa Rica, and Argentina, and they all were relatively flat compared to the increase in pesticide imports in Mexico. Sort of trying to balance out whether or not it was just NAFTA or if all sort of Latin American third world countries were increasing their use as well. So basically that's some of the stuff I'm looking at. Yes, any questions?
Yeah, no, this is fine. We have a lot of people to go through. We're going to get through about 8 today and then 8 on Monday. So it's fine to be short, but we'll want a little bit of time for questions. Henke.
Agriculture exports, yes. Actually, some of the other data that I have is agriculture as a percent of GDP that actually has increased in Mexico, obviously considering trade has increased a lot in Mexico. Compared to other third world countries such as like Chile, Costa Rica, it's increased a little more, not significantly more that I would have really expected to see.
What was your theory about what the effect of NAFTA would be?
I thought the effect of NAFTA, especially in my preliminary analysis, reading what a lot of people thought about the side agreements, I guess when they first came out, everyone was really excited. You know, finally we're going to have free trade with like sort of some environmental, I don't know, constraints written in, some real teeth into it. And so I was expecting to see at least sort of decreases maybe in pesticide. The other factor that I want to look at too is the increases in pesticide consumption and the stability of fertilizer consumption might also be due to just increased agriculture in the area. So I mean maybe per like acre. Actually I have that data and I don't think it actually came out to be decreasing anyway. But I was thinking that maybe per acre might be decreasing if total was increasing. Maybe they were, because of the accords written in, they might be sort of utilizing less, conserving more, but that doesn't necessarily seem to be the case. Okay.
Now, one thing to think about is that you have two different parts of NAFTA, right? One is the kind of the anti-NAFTA crowd, you know, that uses NAFTA to harm the environment, and the other is that the side agreement helped the environment, you know, helped it. So just think about both of those as possible effects of NAFTA, and you're kind of almost evaluating two different things at the same time.
Right. Now, exactly. To me, though, it seems like right now I don't think has done either necessarily that much as compared to what would have been otherwise.
Right. Okay. Good. Okay. Emily?
I was gonna ask. I am asking. Did the side agreement have anything to do with fertilizer or pesticides?
It had a lot of stuff to do with stringent environmental laws, regulations, and the ability to bring environmental cases to there. And I was hoping that environmental groups in Mexico, if pesticide use was rampant, would bring that to the what was the NACEC, which is North American Commission for Environment Cooperation. Actually, there were 11 cases, and I'm not sure specifically what they were. And only one of them was ever investigated, and nothing was ever done in that in general. So I think the whole enforcement part of it was really lacking too, or at least how.
So here's a case where you can do a process tracing to say if the side agreement was having effect. The only way we can imagine it having effect is people bringing cases in them enforcing it, and if we don't see that, then the side agreement can't be having an effect, right? It's not a correlation. Even if the things correlate, you couldn't say it was because of the side agreement because you can't see the process by which the side agreement caused the change in behavior that correlation it looks like was there. So there
Right.
must have been something else happening. And I think the other thing, question Emily's raising though, is to say, which is the, how do you pick your case? You know, it's a question of how you pick your case, and I think, again, in the 10-week term, it's hard to, by the end of the term, you finally know how you pick your cases in week 2, right? So, but it's that kind of question to say, where do you expect to see the impact of the side agreement? I mean, right, that's what I take as the kind of,
Right.
where do you expect to see it, and then look there.
Right.
The problem is you also might not, where you expect to see it, you might not have data for that. So it's, yeah, I lost my keys in the middle of the block, but there's no street light there, so I'll look at the corner, you know, because that's where the street light is.
Right, exactly. So I think where you'd expect to see the real effect of the side agreements would be in the, bless you, in the cases that were brought to it to regulate or whatever, and in the actual NACEC sort of amendment, there really isn't much in the terms of sanctions or compliance, necessarily regulations in there. It's a lot of just, we'll investigate and we'll give them our recommendation, and the country sort of does whatever they want anyway. So I think they could have been written a lot stronger.
Okay, great. Thank you, Eli.
Yeah.
Anybody else want to go next? Okay, Diana.
What I was looking at was sites. I particularly wanted to focus on variation among cases. And what I was looking at is
Tell people what CITES is.
It's the Convention to Protect Endangered Wildlife to Prevent International Trade. And I wanted to look at the effect charisma had on cases. And so I found one really good case for a non-charismatic species, which is the crocodile, both freshwater and saltwater. And I found lots of charismatic cases. The ones I'm focusing on are the rhino and the, I had trouble deciding between the tiger and the sea turtle, but the sea turtle and the crocodile have a lot of characteristics in common, so I chose the sea turtle. And what I found was not what I expected to find at all. I expected to find that CITES, because it garnered a lot of international attention and fame for being a really successful treaty, I expected to find that, you know, international trade, you know, drastically went down, and what the major problem is that like poaching and illegal trade was going to be the big drawback, and that's not what I found at all. In both the cases of charismatic and non-charismatic animals, what I found is I'm not sure how familiar you are with CITES. So the main appendixes are Appendix 1, Appendix 2, 3, and 4. Mainly the focus is on 1 and 2. In order to get on Appendix 1, you have to be highly endangered, and there's no trade allowed anywhere on Appendix 1. Appendix 2 is, you can put it on Appendix 2 if you think that international trade might make it endangered. So there is still some trade, but it's regulated. 3 and 4 are kind of specific to the treaty. We don't really need to concentrate on that. But 1 and 2, I found that in order to get on Appendix 1, you know, you have to be highly endangered, and the actual effect of being on Appendix 1 is that your species would, you know, continue to decline, but much more rapidly. So in that particular case, I found that being on Appendix 1 was almost like an increased danger to species. If you're on Appendix 2, the reason why it's better to be on Appendix 2 is, you know, there's still trade, it's regulated, but there is a incentive to keep wild populations around. You know, you've got ranching and farming of species, and so that's an economic incentive to like keep wild populations at a viable level. What I found in the charismatic versus non-charismatic is no one really particularly considers crocodiles to be, you know, cuddly or cute. Or, I mean, the fact is they kill people, and they're predators for livestock, things like that. But like the sea turtle, everyone wants to see that, you know, sea turtle pull through. It's highly endangered and highly charismatic. But because of the charisma effect, the sea turtle is on Appendix 1, and nothing they can do will get it off of Appendix 1 because of its charisma value. Whereas the crocodile, which was highly endangered, they pulled it from Appendix 1 when its numbers, you know, kind of rose, which actually ended up being for a different reason than being on CITES. and put it on Appendix 2, and its numbers skyrocketed because of the fact that there was now legal incentive, to have like ranching and trading and stuff like that. So that's kind of what I found.
Okay.
If that makes sense at all.
Questions, Lisa?
I had a question. Did you find why, like, when animals were put on Appendix 1, they tended to just go nuts and die off?
Yeah. The one exception I found was the white rhino, and there were, again, different reasons why that didn't fit in with my case. There's no trade at all allowed anywhere if you're on Appendix 1. So what happens is the black market prices skyrocket, and it's so incredibly profitable now, to go against the treaty. And it's kind of complicated. There's not enough field protection, and that's really the real reason, the basic reason why sites can't work, is because, countries don't have incentive. If there's no trade allowed at all legally, governments and customs officials, things like that, they have absolutely no reason to try to enforce sites. They have stockpiles, like let's just take that elephant. They have stockpiles of ivory because, they dehorned their elephants trying to prevent poachers from killing them. And also, seizure of illegal poachers, their stockpiles. So they've got all the stockpile. And what they wanted to do was to sell the stockpile and give the money to conservation efforts within their own countries, which seems like a reasonable thing to do. But sites won't allow them to do that, thinking that it's going to, spark increased poaching. And, if there's legal means of it, then, ivory is just going to go nuts again like it did. So since there's no trade allowed at all, there's no legal reason to keep wild populations, and you can't fund your conservation efforts legally and stuff like that. So it's just really bad, because if there's no field protection and there's a really big incentive to go kill elephants and steal their ivory, then that's what's going to happen.
In Tuesday's New York Times, there's a nice piece on protecting gorillas, and it talks about the just on-the-ground problems, especially in a war-torn region of Africa, where, let's say the Congolese border, where you're paying these guys nothing for wages, and they're supposed to go in there and protect the guerrillas against poachers who are armed with AK-47s and stuff like this. So, and they're actually being successful by paying them enough. They are actually overcoming some of those problems in some of the countries, but in the war-torn regions, it's more difficult.
One thing that was interesting is that there are some states in Africa that are really trying to, address this problem, and they have heavily patrolled areas with heavily armed guards that are allowed to shoot on site. And while that has, increased populations in some countries, they still have, they can't do anything with their stockpiles. I mean, the money has to come from somewhere, and pretty much across the board, conservation efforts in developing countries are really poorly funded. So.
And one thing here, too, to think about is this thing about generalizability, right? To think about what other cases are like this. I mean, to think about the dynamic that Diana just nicely laid out about how, actually banning it makes things worse rather than better. It's this, you can think of some similar dynamics with this kind of questions about passing out condoms, right? Does passing out condoms increase sexual activity or not? And you have all these very complex effects, and you need to think about, is this something you can actually really ban and stop, or is it something that there's going to be so much pressure that people will figure out ways to do? People are very creative at finding ways around laws if they need to be, and if there's enough incentives there. So I think about that. Another last quick question, Eli.
I was just wondering, how would you restructure sites to be more effective?
That's a great question, and actually I've read a lot of material on that. The number one thing they said is that sites was misfounded. It's actually the loss of habitat that's so destructive, to species. And international trade is such a small threat to what it is. Even the numbers that they have with poaching and everything else included, it's still such a small threat that habitat loss. I think the numbers they gave me were 80% versus 20% on trade. So it's misfounded, but we can still use it. It's got a lot of good things to it. One thing that should be done is it should be based on sustainable trade practices, and it's not good to ban it completely. If you can start putting in, like the thing with the crocodile, the reason why it succeeded is it was moved from Appendix 1 to Appendix 2. So there should just be one appendix, and that's all for sustainable trade. And 2, there should be like funding and incentive for individual countries with these, they're called range states, that pretty much have complete control over a species, to institute like farming and ranching techniques and things like that, where you can take a certain amount from the wild and captive breeding and all that kind of stuff. So if you think about sustainability and just reducing the appendix to one appendix, you could have some potentially really great effects for sites.
Okay, good. That segues nicely to somebody's paper. It's either Mark's or Reese's. Who did the the Pacific Salmon Convention, right? And you were talking about habitat loss as a cause for. Yeah, Risa, you're up.
Okay, so I looked at the Pacific Salmon Treaty and the Pacific Salmon Commission that was established by the treaty in 1985. And it was between Canada and the United States, and I wanted to see if it actually improved the situation, because the salmon was like in a really, really bad state. And it was Pacific salmon, and there's 4 different species. And I kind of looked at the different species because they live in different areas. Areas in the United States that were under the treaty are Washington and Oregon, and then Alaska. And there was Canada and the BC region. So they mainly looked at the transboundary rivers, the rivers that cross between the United States and Canada. And what I found was that it was really successful in BC in the Fraser River area, and then it was really successful in Alaska. And but it wasn't very successful in Oregon or Washington. And I found that there were 3 different reasons that could have accounted for that. And one was the original reason why the species deteriorated in these different places in the first place, and whether the things the treaty actually addressed those initial issues. And it turns out that in the places where it didn't work, it was mainly habitat loss, and then secondary to that, overfishing. And the treaty addresses solely overfishing, and it doesn't address habitat loss very much. So basically it's only solving half of the problem, or like a third of the problem, because most of it came from habitat loss in Washington and Oregon. Whereas in the Fraser River area in Canada and in Alaska, it was mainly overfishing that killed the population, and then habitat loss was secondary. So in those 2 cases, the treaty was solving the main problem. So that was one thing. And then the other thing that might have affected the effectiveness of the treaty was the availability of information. And it turns out that it's way better in the Fraser River area in Alaska, just simply because they already had this conservation infrastructure set up. Alaska had a really strong in-state conservation system that was already in place since like the 1940s. Right before the treaty came in, and then the treaty was just like a supplement to what was already in place. And then in the Fraser River area in 1937, they had already set up this entire treaty for specifically the Fraser River Panel area, and they started gathering data, and they started setting up this whole communication mechanism. So the treaty was just a supplement to that too. But then in Washington and Oregon, there wasn't any such conservation mechanism in place already. So the treaty had to start from scratch, and it wasn't very good at doing that. It needed to set up a lot of, groundwork and communication systems and, database systems, and it didn't account for those. And that's why it was a lot more successful when it could just kind of free ride off the backs of the things that were already in place in Canada and Alaska. Now, the other thing that I found that affected the treaty was whether the area was subjected to abundance-based or harvest ceiling-based management. And what that means is, with abundance-based management, they set catch allocations according to how many fish are running in the season, and the system is on a daily basis, they track how many salmon are going through the river, and the database is updated daily. And then so on a daily basis, they kind of change the catch allocation, so they definitely don't go over. And with a harvest ceiling-based management, they don't really care how many salmon are going in and out on a seasonal or daily basis. They just set a ceiling before the season begins and say, okay, you can't catch more than this. So it may well be that the harvest ceiling is a lot more than the actual number of salmon that are going through the river. And what happened was in Alaska and the Fraser River, it was abundant space management just because the system was already in place. They had a really good information system where they could figure out how many salmon were going through the rivers on a day-to-day basis and then feed back that information to the panels who were setting the catch allocations. So they were able to do the abundance-based management in those two areas, but in Oregon and Washington, there wasn't that system of daily information where they could update it and tell the right people and then they tell the fisheries. They didn't have that communication network, so all they could do was set the catch allocations, and a lot of times it wasn't a very accurate estimate. So that's generally what I found. Alaska and BC was relatively successful in maintaining and actually improving a lot of the salmon population that was there, but in Washington and Oregon, in fact, I think even in '93, and the treaty was set up in '95, in '93, 3 species were put on the endangered species list. 2 were threatened, 1 was endangered. So that kind of goes to show how exactly bad the situation is.
Okay. One of the things to notice here that Reese has done is the good thing is to notice, hey, it actually causality matters, right? That they got it wrong in terms of saying, oh, it's an overharvesting problem, so let's solve the overharvesting problem by controlling take, when in fact they should have been blowing up dams and cleaning up the habitat problem, because they're not going to solve it if a third of the problem is due to the overharvesting. So that's one. And the other then is to push Risa in kind of her last round of revisions to say, she just told a story in which she has 3 independent variables, all of which explain the dependent variable, right? She's got a nice correlation between what you could call fit. Did they get the problem right? Did they have information availability? And did they have abundance-based versus harvest ceiling rules? Which one of those? All 3 go along with the dependent variable. And you want to at least evaluate the question of saying, well, if you design one, do you need all 3 of those, or do you only need one of them? Is it, if you get the fit right, if you get a harvest and a habitat thing, which of these do you need?
Right.
You're the way you've set it up, you said, well, all these things, 3 things correlate. But which, can you find the causal pathways? And maybe they explain different elements of the success. Or maybe they're just, 2 of them were just superfluous. You didn't really need them, right? If you had the information system well, then it wouldn't matter if you got the question right. So just, you want to think about which of these is really doing the work here. Maybe all 3. And then say what parts of the work are they doing, that they have to work together in order to do this. Or do you only need one of them? So that's, I think, just a kind of push on that. Okay, next person, Malika.
Oh, can I get the overhead?
Yep. Put one on you think about it.
Okay, I examined the Basel Convention on the Control of Transboundary Movements of Hazardous Waste. And this is a treaty that tries to limit shipments of hazardous waste between developed countries and developing countries, or that was the primary goal of it. It went into effect it was signed in 1989 and went into effect in 1992. And the question I'm asking is, will a total ban on shipments of hazardous waste to developing countries be environmentally beneficial? I had a lot of trouble finding data. I finally found data on non-ferrous metals, that is like non-iron and steel, and it's also hard to differentiate between just scrap metal from cars going in and hazardous material and hazardous metal. And this one, I did find this data. So, and as you can see, 1992 when the treaty went into force, nothing happened. Like it keeps going up. In fact, it might have gone up faster after the treaty was signed. So, this is how I went about thinking about my independent variables. I guess since the waste is the dependent variable, I looked at supply side, that is the developed countries, they'd be pushing the waste onto the market because they were just generating so much, or legislation forced them. It became really expensive for them to keep the waste in their own country. So the other thing was the second variable I was looking at was the Basel Convention, interference of regulation and how that worked. And third one is pull the demand side from the developing countries, like whether they wanted the waste or not. And so those are the three independent variables. So the first independent variable is Basel, just before and after. It's the predicted effect would be increasing before the treaty and decreasing after the treaty. The second independent variable was supply. NFM, non-ferrous material, it's mostly zinc, copper, and lead. And I managed to get some data for zinc and lead. And this is production, this is worldwide production. And that's analogous to OECD production, so I think it's a good fit. And so it just shows you how many thousand tons were produced per year, and then and you can see in 1992 there's just pretty much, it's been going up slightly from the 80s onwards. And then I looked at the demand side pull and looked at how much the vehicle population, vehicles use a lot of lead from in developing countries. Vehicles use a lot of scrap metal, recycled metal. So it's mostly, like 60% of it is recycled. So measuring how many cars they're producing helps you, tells you how much, what their demand is for metal. And this is not something I came up with. Other people have been using this measure. So, and you can see that, it's going up by huge percent, 17%. This is Malaysia and India. The other figures I got were for South Korea and Taiwan, but I thought they were too developed to include, so I left them out. And just notice the year 1992, it's going up 19%. So, and those are the predicted DVs. And so if you just put them all together, here are the years and your three independent variables and your dependent variable, and I think it's pretty obvious to everyone like which one correlates the most with the dependent variable. And I was really surprised to find this because my story initially was, the developed countries are just finding an easy way to get rid of their metal waste, and so the poor developing countries are being stuck with it. But I mean, I was really surprised to find that there's this huge demand for recycled metal, and in fact, the policy implication for, since going back to this thing. If you go look at this, if you're going to influence one of these three DVs, I guess demand side, I would have to decide the demand side would be the one you should focus your attention on. And the thing is that if you have a total ban that Basel is trying to do right now, or has implemented, is from 1998 onwards, is that you're going to make developing countries or take fresh ore out of the earth for metals, and it's going to make things much more expensive, and it's environmentally unfriendly. And the second thing is there is a lot of proof that there's a huge informal or illegal sector of waste recycling going on now, where before it was legal and now it's illegal, but it still goes on. So, and if you do have them under some sort of legal umbrella, then you have some chance of monitoring them for worker standards and work safety and environmental standards. But if you don't, if they're completely off the legal radar, then you're not going to have that. So, I guess the sort of the doubts I've sort of been working with is, firstly, do I need an additional independent variable? And have I measured my current supply and demand sufficiently? If I get data for copper for the supply side, then I'm happy with that. But the demand side, I don't know if that's, it's a fair measure or not. Then holes in the causal explanation, like, am I not making sense? How convinced are you that a total ban on hazardous waste shipments may not be optimal for the environment in developing countries? Like, does it surprise you? Because I was really surprised to come up with this. And I spent a long time, like, trying to tell myself it wasn't true. And I was like, no, this is not supposed to happen. But, it's wrong, it's wrong, it's wrong. And then I was really surprised to find I was just not getting out of it. And the data manipulation, there's like two very explicit sets of data out there. One is generated by environmentalists, and it's all very fuzzy and like predictions, and the second set is generated by industry. And all these numbers, pretty much every number you see here is like an industry number. So I don't know how much the truth to it or what else is behind it and stuff like that. So that's something you can look at.
Great. Thank you. Any questions or comments?
What were you looking at? Copper shipments?
I was just looking at
Non-ferrous metals, right?
Yeah, non-ferrous metals. That is anything but iron and steel. And and it's mostly like 95% of that is lead, zinc, or copper. So if you get numbers from those, you can tell how much NFM is in. And if you notice, I don't have numbers on this thing. There's a trade index I found in an industry journal, and the only reason I can use it is because it is hazardous waste, and
So it's regulated. Non-ferrous metal trade is regulated under Basel.
it is regulated under Basel from now on, but it was under the recycling thing, so it was legal to trade it, and that's why you have legal numbers. But this is this is probably gonna drop to zero, like theoretically, very soon, because it's gonna be illegal.
Okay.
Does that answer your question?
Sarah, briefly.
So the Basel Convention is regulating the supply side.
Right.
Is there
Or
any
just regulating the shipment.
right? So is there any way that it could provide provisions to like deal with the demand side?
Right.
At all?
Sorry, I didn't come to that. They have positive measures. The Basel Treaty has positive measures, but I calculated that for every $5 million in shipments, there's $1 of aid going to help environmental problem in the area the shipment is going to. So I think even if you could get that up to $10 per 5 million, you've increased your supply by 10 times. What is the other positive measure? I'm blanking right now. And a lot of it is like there's clean technology, technology transfer mechanisms and stuff like that, but they're all inactive. Okay. And I think there's a lot of stuff going on right now trying to get that up.
Okay. I think we should move on, see if we can get at least one or two more people. Sarah, do you want to go? Okay. Mark? You begged off, right? Ellie? Great. Okay, good. Is the mic working off this? Okay.
Can I get this off?
No, Allie's going to use it.
Okay, my treaty that I worked on was the Barcelona Convention, which tried to increase the environmental quality in the Mediterranean. And it went into force back in 1978, and since then it was an umbrella convention, which really didn't do much. But since then there's been like all these protocols to take care of hazardous waste and oil and lots of different things that the Mediterranean countries seem to think is a problem. So I used 3 different dependent variables, and my independent variable was the states of various things, the Barcelona Convention, which was the umbrella, and the LBS protocol, which is the land-based sources protocol, which attempted to decrease pollution from land-based sources. And the reason they're focusing on that is because 85% of pollution comes from land-based sources. So it's a little more important than worrying about oil spills and such in that area. So my dependent variables were the level of mercury, and that has to do with the state of the LBS protocol. And then the state of environmental agencies, national environmental agencies, which was something that the Barcelona Convention was working on, and the French environmental budget. And the reason I focused on France was because they're one of only 2 countries at the time that actually had an environmental agency, the other one being Israel, of which I couldn't find their budget. And that also has to do with the Barcelona Convention. So starting with mercury, I'm only giving you a few, like I've got way more than this, luckily. The top one is mercury in France, in the water, coastal water, so a little bit further off shore than like on the beach. And the LBS protocol went into effect in 1983. And as you can see, like, mercury's still going up until 1988. I don't have any data past that because it's like confidential and the French don't want to use it. I don't know why. And then on the bottom there's the mercury concentration in mussels in France. And that has been going down since about 1974 because that's when France put this big old pollution protocol that they're trying to decrease the mercury out of their electrolytic industry, which is where most mercury pollution comes from. But then in 1983, when the land-based protocol came in, mercury pretty much went back up. Didn't work. I'm trying to do this as fast as possible, it's going to take a long time. Here's a counterfactual, which is the lead in water. And lead was not supposed to be eliminated by the land-based sources protocol. It's just supposed to be regulated. But as you can see, lead's still going up just like the mercury still was. So the second dependent variable I was looking at was the creation of national environmental authorities. And this is one that we looked at in class a few weeks ago that Ron brought up. And I decided that since the Barcelona Convention was brought around in 1978, that environmental agencies that were born because of the convention itself probably should have been made between 1978 and 1982 because of government bureaucracy and slowness and such. And the reason I picked 1982 actually was because that was the date the class picked back when we looked over this. So it wasn't just something that I made up. And from that, only 9 of the 23 agencies on here actually were made in between those 4 years. And of the 12 countries on here, possibly, if you're stretching it, 6 could say that they're actually affected by the treaty in that way. Those include Greece, Algeria, and Spain, who all created their regulatory agencies, which is an actual environmental agency such as the EPA. Coordinative is just like somebody that stands around and tries to make all the other agencies do environmental things, so they really don't do much. The other 2 countries that could have been affected would be Libya and Turkey, because they created their coordinative agencies in between 78 and 82, and mostly Egypt, because they actually did all their environmental agency building in those 4 years. Now, with those 6 countries, there is absolutely no relationship between their GDP. So, I don't know why they would be affected by the treaty rather than others. Because you think that developing countries would probably be more affected, because some of the other ones already had it on their national agenda, as I'll talk about in a second. My third dependent variable is a French environmental budget. Now, French, as I said before, was one of only 2 countries that had environmental agencies at the time the Barcelona Convention was passed in 1978. And they also had and still have the highest GDP in the area by quite a bit. And they have trade links with every single country in the Mediterranean. So, in most literature, they're thought of as the hegemon. Is that how you say it?
Hegemon.
Hegemon. So, I thought, like, since they're in the leadership role, they're the one that brought up the treaty in the first place, that they should actually, even if their environmental budget stabilizes, it should still be increasing due to inflation, especially in the late 1970s when there was the big inflation crisis. But as you can see, it's pretty much staying the same, not much. And as a percent of their budget, their environmental programs are going down. So what I think really happened, I don't think the Barcelona Convention and its protocols actually did much. What I think actually happened, maybe for some countries, that environmental things were already on the agenda, such as in Israel and France, because they already had regulatory agencies, and they may have seen the convention as a way to spread the environmental costs of taking care of the Mediterranean. And I also think maybe that was the case for Spain, because they were really fast to make their regulatory agency right after the convention came in, and that's a little fast for government bureaucracy. And the second thing I think may have happened would have been the rising GDP and education theory, that when that happens, environmental awareness goes up in the governments and in the populace. And this was one of the first treaties that actually had epistemic involvement. Is the guy that actually studied this treaty back in 1990 that came up with a theory of epistemic communities. And the ones that, I guess you'd say the treaty worked best in according to him, were the ones that had the most epistemic involvement.
Great. Thank you, Allie.
I just have a question about your North books. Was that all stuff going into the Mediterranean only?
That's
or was
like,
that their general?
that's, they went out and pulled water up and
Okay, but from the Mediterranean, right?
yeah, off the coast of France. They also have something like Adriatic and stuff, but
Because I was just wondering, because I had numbers from the Atlantic, and they sort of were telling me different things. So I was like, wait.
yeah,
So-
yours was one of my counterfactuals.
So, Kari, do you want to do yours briefly? Yeah?
Oh God. I guess. Sure.
Okay. And this will be the last one, and then everybody else gets off the hook until Tuesday.
I did the 1992 OSPAR Convention, which is the Convention for the Protection of the Northeast Atlantic, and it combined two previous conventions, both protecting the Paris Convention and the Oslo Convention, both protecting the North Atlantic. And the point of it's a pretty broad convention, tries to affect most maritime problems. I focused on mercury emissions. And just, I wanted to see, because it was one of the very first issues that OSPAR focused on, so I wanted to see whether the treaty had affected any change in mercury levels, because it was one of the very first things it put out was saying that they wanted to create a standstill principle for mercury and then decrease mercury levels. What I found is that overall, the treaty, I really do think that it did a pretty good job of influencing nations to change their policy. It doesn't necessarily have any mechanisms for enforcement, but because of, I think a lot of it has to do with sort of the region that they're all so close to each other that they're able to work together pretty well. And the one thing I would sort of say that it did a pretty good job in decreasing overall levels, but it didn't necessarily create an incentive for how to do that. So they separated like water, air, and product, and they have all the different levels for that, but they didn't create like specific things. And that, like, as the treaty progressed, because it started out in things started that were passed in like 1980, and then it continued on 1985. It got more and more specific, so that was like definitely showed development in the treaty, that it was able to sort of take the new data and evolve according to what it was given. But like when I was looking, I would look at some nations, and they really would sort of overall would decrease their like chloralkali plants, which is the main producer of mercury pollution in the Northeast Atlantic. And they started switching over to non-mercury plants using non-mercury cells and things like that. But then a lot of the nations that were phasing out, instead of phasing out equally on both types of plants, they would just phase out all of their plants that were non-mercury using plants, and they would continue on using the mercury plants. And then so it was sort of like it was sort of backwards, where you'd hope that OSPAR would do the opposite, where it would have the nations phase out their mercury using plants first, and then if they were phasing out their total production of chlorine, that they would phase out the mercury first and then go for the non-mercury plants. But the regime didn't create any incentive to do that. So I think that was probably the main failure of the regime. And I don't know what else.
Okay.
Any question?
Any questions? Okay, nice job. And I think actually one of the nice things we see across the 6 papers is really different ways people are trying to attack the causal problems, right? You know, getting variation across different species, across different countries, across, looking at counterfactuals from different areas. So, but all trying to get at the same sorts of problems. So I think that's good. And so hopefully you can have learned a little bit from what other people are, how they're attacking their problem as well. All right, thanks, Kari. Okay, so now we'll switch modes a bit and I'll just take about 15 minutes or so to try to get the game up on people's radar screens. And then we'll have a few minutes for questions as well. We have two new people, so we should at least get faces with names, at least for the new people. You're Reed, okay, and Dan. Okay, great. So Reed and Dan have been generous enough to offer to play with us on Saturday. And actually, we now have two people who've canceled out. If anybody has friends who they would want, who they think would want to play, have them email me today, and we can get a packet to them. Okay.
I need to know in specific.
What? Yeah, they'll need to come pick up a packet from my office.
They can be just anyone, any major.
Yeah, right. They can be from any major or whatever. So let's. What I want to do is go through. Briefly just give you a bit of background. Hopefully I'll go through this quickly because I think we've done enough climate change that people know the basics of climate change, but we'll just remind a little. Just again, this won't matter much for the simulation, but everybody knows the major greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide, which is the only one regulated in the simulation. It's responsible for about 60% of anthropogenic, meaning human-induced changes in the climate. Another 20% is due to methane. Most of the CO2 comes from fossil fuel use, right? Methane comes from mainly rice paddies and cattle farming. Okay. Another 20%, and then another 20% is sort of nitrous oxides, N2O. And CFCs and ozone, okay? But again, make sure you keep this CFCs problem separate from the climate change problem, right? Usually, the major effect of CFCs is the ozone hole loss problem. The ozone problem as a contributor to climate change is low-level ozone issues, okay? Consequences, changing the energy balance of the atmosphere, sea level rise, changing in agricultural ecological niches, and so agriculture will have to change, so people will be growing bananas in Siberia. Lots of other changes that most of you know about. What are the characteristics of it? Global scale problem. A lot of uncertainty about what the impacts will be, that we now are becoming increasingly convinced that there's a problem, but knowing what the problems will be, where they'll happen, etc., is very difficult to predict. And the other thing is the feedbacks are very slow, right? That we're not going to get feedbacks very quickly. And so part of what this simulation attempts to do, and this is a simulation, actually that's kind of impressive. I played this when I was in graduate school 10 years ago. It was set up then, and it hasn't been changed much. And I think it still holds up reasonably well as a way to get at the major features of the kinds of negotiations that are going on. And what we're trying to do is set up, basically a standard. Again, this is a much more full-bodied version of the tragedy of the commons, right? That's what's going on here, with a couple of different aspects to it. You all know the climate change history. There's been a long scientific interest in how humans are affecting the global environment. The initial concern was back in the early 1980s at a conference in Env'l, where some of this climate change started coming out. It got a lot of prominence in the late 80s. In America, the major kind of event that people think about is James Hansen a really warm summer, and Jim Hansen going down to Congress and saying these warm summers are due to climate change, human-induced climate change. Whether that was true or not at the time is another question, but it certainly got people's attention. They established the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which has now come out with its third report. They came out with one in 1990, one in 95, and the 2001 has just come out. You can read it on the web at ipcc.org, I think. So if you want to read the newest report, which is not out in print yet, but it's available, to see that this is a group of about 4,000 and growing scientists who kind of say, what's the state of play? What do we know about climate change? at least partly in response to that, and this big project I'm doing at Harvard is actually to see what's the response. You have these big science reports. Do they have any impact? And at least part of it is to investigate, is this causally linked to that? Is the fact that we signed an agreement in 92 causally linked to the fact that we had this big science report in 1990? So again, trying to ask that causal question of all the money we're spending to fly people like Steve Schneider around the world, does that pay off in terms of getting some policy change in the end? Right, that's what we want to know. In 92 at UNCED down in Rio, they signed the Convention on Climate Change. Notice that, what's the first sort of thing that this 150 nations signing the climate change agreement make you think? How much thought went into calculating whether this treaty was in your interests? Not at all. Big PR benefits, right? What are you going to do, not sign this thing? The whole world's watching. Every newspaper in the world is writing up what's going on at UNCED, and you're not going to sign? And a few countries didn't, right? Including the US on biodiversity, Malaysia on the forest principles, etc. But in general, that was a pretty costly step to take. Why not just sign and don't worry about compliance later, right? Sign up to anything. Who cares? They're not going to force you to comply later. And I think that's one of the issues we'll engage in the game. How do you get states to comply in an anarchic world, right? Okay, and then the two follow-ons, even these slides haven't been updated. 97, the Kyoto Protocol. So this framework convention is a nice vague convention that doesn't have targets and timetables. In 97, at the Kyoto meeting, they agreed to targets and timetables, largely, on average, a 5% reduction from 1990 levels by the year 2008 through 2012 for those countries that signed up to them. Okay, actually, there's variation among the industrialized countries in what they signed up. We've seen all this in the class earlier. In the course of the class, we've learned about the different negotiation processes. I won't go through those. So then go through the analytic themes of the game, okay? Trying to lay out basically a commons problem, okay? Standard commons problem. Much more complicated than the one we did on the web, several weeks back. So you have a commons problem where everybody is producing CO2 and everybody might be a victim of it. So the calculations that will be done during the course of the game on Saturday, there's a computer model that will generate what the impacts are for you. It's massively multilateral. That's why we're going to have 20, 22, 23 countries involved, or people representing those countries, trying to make the world as complex. And notice that when you have 23, what do you have in the real world? 180. Okay, so it gets even more complicated, and so you have groups form. You have OECD versus the group of 77, the developing countries. You have the US versus the EU. So you have groups forming of states. Asymmetric interests. Okay, differences in what people want to achieve, in how easily they can achieve it. Differences in what the costs of abatement of CO2 are. Differences in whether they have access in the simulation to whether they're a developing country and have access to the World Atmosphere Fund or not, whether you have to contribute to it. So different interests. That all these activities underlying it are deeply embedded in national behavior. Okay, to think that, as opposed to the ozone problem, right, the CFC problem, where you were changing a nano bit of the economy here. When you're dealing with the CO2 problem, you're dealing with, especially in the industrialized states, something that means completely morphing your whole economy to make change. So you are talking about percentages of GNP in the calculations. That the less developed countries have real power in this negotiation. I mean, both in the real world and in the simulation. That there is uncertainty, right? So in the game that there's going to be this point after round 3 where we're going to get a new report about that might say that we just found out climate change is much worse than it's about to happen, or we might find out it's not so much worse. It's better. That in fact we don't need to. The scientists have now decided we don't need to worry about it. We need, that climate change has nothing to do with CO2 emissions, right? So that we have uncertainty which we're going to get, we won't get certain information in year 3, we'll get a new set of uncertain information, right? Like in the real world, we're going to get new IPCC reports that say, here's what we think the world looks like now. So the kind of process for the game is one in which you have all the countries will be participating. There will then be the first few periods where you are going to select how you're going to play, whether you're going to comply with your obligations under the agreement or not. And then we'll have a process for amending the treaty as well in round 4, okay? I'm going to go through this briefly and then we'll get to the questions. The bottom line, all of you have read this stuff, so it should be straightforward. The bottom line, everybody's a signatory, so we don't have any non-parties in the room. There's emissions. The basic obligations are the developed countries have to reduce to 80% of the baseline. The developing countries can increase up to 200% of their baseline. In fact, in the World Atmosphere Fund, this contributory fund, all the industrialized countries have to make a 0.1% contribution of GNP, and the distribution of whatever, and those countries can comply or not. The industrialized countries don't have to pay that. That's what they're committed to paying, but they can fail to comply in one of two ways, right? A developed country can fail to comply either by emitting more than 80% of their baseline or by not contributing to the WAF, right? That's what, and then if a developing country complies, that is 200% or less of its baseline emissions, it gets its share of the WAF, okay? So let's say all the developing countries comply, then it's split according to the formula laid out in the instructions. But if Eli is the only developing country that complies, I don't even know if he's a developing country, then he gets 100% of the WAF. If all the other countries violate, then he gets all the contributions. Now that contribution may be small because Kari may be the only developed country that actually contributed, okay? But Eli will get all of that based on the formulas in the thing. And then the last thing is just in the amendment period, it requires a 2/3 overall majority and a simple majority of both sides. Okay, so greater than 50% of the industrialized countries and greater than 50% of the developing countries have to agree to the amendment, as well as 2/3 total in order for it to work. So you can't just get 2/3 of the countries and have that be 90% of the industrialized states. Okay. You have a question, Sarah? Yeah, give me one. We're almost through this, so let me get. Yeah, if you can wait. Playing the game. Essentially, your goal is to maximize, this GNP type number, right? And maximize GNP. And again, although it simplifies drastically to quantify everything in terms of GNP the way they did, and move it all forward into the, move it all to the present, etc. There's lots of simplifications, but stay in that frame, okay? That is, it's complicated enough without thinking about, well, some of these costs don't come due till later and some come due now, that we haven't monetized the environmental effects well enough. Yes, that's all true, but the game works better if you kind of say, okay, let's believe that we have monetized it somehow, not exactly accurately. Your costs are, your costs and benefits, your welfare function as a country is determined by what your own emissions are. Why does that matter? Because it determines how much you're spending to abate those emissions, right? You incur costs to reduce your emissions. So one of your costs is that your cost to abate emissions. This should take you back to Sprins and Manorana's article about, right, abatement costs and ecological vulnerability. So it's your emissions, global emissions, because what happens to your GNP depends on the climate change impacts, and those climate change impacts are not due only to your own emissions, but due to the emissions of the world, right? So you'll have some set of costs that are determined by how much global emissions are. What's the relationship between your emissions and global emissions? I mean, there's a mechanical, whatever your fraction is, right? But what's the kind of political connection between those? Why You want to reduce, you want to keep this, minimize this, right? You also want to minimize your cost due to global emissions. So you want to maximize the reductions of others, whereas minimizing your own reductions. But what's the problem here? What's the strategic problem? Megan?
So does everybody else.
What?
So does everybody else.
Okay, so does everybody else. But what's the linkage too? What's conceptually, especially in this kind of negotiation, what matters?
If you negotiate with everyone, say you're going to make a certain cut, then you can not follow the rules and sort of like tragedy of the commons situation where you made tons of money if everyone else complied and you didn't.
Okay, so one is that at least if it's only a one-round game, you may be able to fool everybody else into say you're going to comply and everybody else says they're going to comply, and then you can fool everybody else into complying and you don't, right? Except, as Megan just pointed out, yeah, and like ditto for everybody else, right? So actually your emissions matter in a kind of iterative sense, right? Because what you emit this period not only is affecting your emissions, but it's also affecting the emissions of the world, because if you comply, that's a cost to you. But it may have an offsetting benefit if by your compliance you can convince enough other people, enough other countries to comply, right? So your compliance has a cost side, but it has a benefit side if you can create that benefit side, if you can make other people's behavior be contingent on your own. Okay, get them to convince that if I comply, you'll really comply, and we can then work together that way. From a developing country state point of view, WAF, there's your contributions to the World Atmosphere Fund. You can provide bilateral aid, essentially the same as trading. If Eli's a developing country, I'm a developed country, I can pay him to make emission reductions, right? And we can even say, you make an emission reduction, I pay you for it, and we're going to verbally tell everybody about it and say, this is a trade. So we're going to go over it. We're not going to comply with the treaty, but don't sanction us afterwards because I got Eli to make the reduction for me and I paid him for it, and so that was a trade, right? So it doesn't, and then maybe at the amendment point, we might want to then negotiate so that, a new set of agreements that say, as long as you say beforehand what the trade is and both sides comply, the money transfers and the emissions get cut, that's legal. You're still then we're in compliance, but that won't work the first few rounds. So there's bilateral aid and bilateral sanctions, okay? Depends on your decisions and others. Okay, and then you'll make provide a ballot, and then the computer will figure out what happens. Okay, just to make sure people understand. Did people understand how to read their emission control costs? Right. That is, you're calculating. So here's your emissions, and I believe, let's say this country is. I think this looks like actually the Germans' graphs. I'm not sure though. But let's say you're at this level currently, and this is your 80% level, right? This is your 100% level. This is your 80% level. Then your reduction, and I don't know if we have it. Right. So your reduction is, you're just, to comply, it's going to cost you $15 billion approximately, right? And we can actually figure out what that is. Okay, so you actually can look at the cost table is just another way of providing this information. And here it's, I think it's the same country, so that your, right, so that it costs you actually, the base level was 250, so I was wrong in reading on the chart. The cost to comply with the GAC is $25 billion, okay? It's just the difference between the base level and this. And in fact, this is true in all years. No matter where you are on this chart, it's always 25 difference between this row and this row, okay? Does that make sense to people? Going across the columns is how much everybody else is emitting, okay? Does that make sense? Emily.
What are the,
okay,
where do the columns come from?
The columns are the world emissions. Okay, so this is telling you, given everybody else's emissions and your own emissions, what are your costs? So the way you use this is to say, well, I've got to decide whether to comply or not, right? And it's always going to, you can actually figure out that it's always going to cost the difference between these two. So I guess it's 15 is the difference, right? And then you want to see, but what are my total costs going to be? Well, they're dependent not only on what level of CO2 emissions I emit, and I can emit more or less than my, I can just, emit a lot, right? I mean, it gets better and better the higher I go, right? I have no cost if I emit at 750 megatons a year, but only if everybody else cuts back, right? This goes back to Kari's thing, is if I can fail to comply, but everybody else complies, I end up at zero cost. That's a good thing, right? But it's unlikely you'll end up here because everybody else is going to be cheating and they'll be up here, right? So your total cost will be 60, and then you would be really stupid to comply then because you only double your cost here by being in compliance there. Okay? Does that make sense? How to read it? It may take a little bit of time to sort it out, but why don't I leave it there? And last thing is just to make sure you know these are what the ballots will look like. You just will have your country, what round it is, what your CO2 emissions are, right? You have to say what your emissions were relative to the what your baseline was, your WAF contributions, if you're a developed country, and then any bilateral aid payments or trade sanctions, okay? Because those are the things you're deciding each round, depending on whether you're developing or developed country. Okay, questions? Are there questions about how it's played? Sarah?
As far as amendments, is that, I guess you gave sort of one example of why you would want to make an amendment. Are there lots of reasons why we want to make amendments, or do we have to make amendments? There's only one real chance to make amendments.
Right. So what would be other things about amendments? You might want to set up some kind of sanctioning mechanism to say if this happens, all countries agree to sanction, right? If any country violates, they will have this sanction imposed collectively. Then how do you ensure that gets enforced is another question altogether, right? But there's no sanctions in the treaty as it's written right now.
Okay.
So you could have aid things saying everybody. You could have a thing that says you could have an amendment that says no, the developed countries get some fraction of the WAF as well, even though they're contributing to it. If they comply as well with their emissions reductions, they get some fraction of that back. This is up to you. How do you think you can get this agreement to work well? And think about it. I mean, if you want to, go back to what's happening in The Hague, go back to the links on the webpage about what happened in The Hague, and go back and read the Framework Convention on Climate Change and the Kyoto Protocol and the draft Hague amendments, and try to say how much of that is relevant to what we're doing here, okay?
So on the first round, it's not like if people don't comply, they automatically get sanctions. It's sort of like on the...
No, there's no reason that you can...
sanctions imposed, you write on your little ballot, maybe in the next round.
You got it, right. In the first round...
Like, if people don't comply, then you can be like, oh, right. I'm mad at that person.
Right. Well, presumably, right, yeah, for not complying. But presumably, I can just say, Eli is Iraq, and I'm just going to sanction him just for the pure pleasure of it before he's ever complied or not complied anyway, right? I mean, sanctioning is costly like it is in the real world, but also notice that there's no forced sanction. We could play all 6 rounds or whatever it is, 7 rounds, and have no sanctions occur, right?
The WAF thing is automatic?
The WAF, once there's contributions, yes, the money goes from the developed countries into the WAF, and then it will be paid out.
Each round?
Yep. And there will be, you will get a summary like this. In other words, the computer will generate, after everybody's done their thing, a summary like this of all the countries, what their emissions were, whether they were in compliance or not, et cetera.
So there will be transparency.
There will be transparency at one level, yes. What was in the WAF, et cetera, what, bilateral aid, et cetera. And you will get your own personal thing. See, that's a transparency of what people did, but you will get your own personal thing about what. You won't have transparency about what people's costs, who's winning and who's losing as the game gets played, right? You don't know what their underlying costs are, and that's why I sent out the email yesterday about saying, and you can't reveal those to other people, okay? You can negotiate with other people. We want that credibility problem of I can't prove to you that I'm losing money or gaining money or how I'm doing relative to you, right?
How will we really know? Oh, total losses.
This will tell you all. The game's been played often enough that it'll tell you the answers to most of the questions you want about where you are. You know, so yes, for this round you lost $14 billion.
We don't know who.
You don't know what you're doing relative to others, except if you ask Mark and he says, well, yeah, I lost 25 billion last term period, except the bottom line is he might have only lost 5. He might lie, right? So that's the real problem, right? That's the real problem in real life is that how do you make credible statements, you know, about what you're doing? And we're not going to allow you to reveal the paper. Other questions?
Do you always know who sanctioned you?
Yes, the sanctions will be public. I believe. Yes, yeah. You will know who sanctioned you.
And you don't know the cost of when you impose sanctions on another country, the cost that country is incurring.
Yeah, no, they are one-to-one. That if it costs me 10 million, 10 million to sanction you, it imposes a $10 million cost on you. I think I haven't read it carefully, but I think that's what the instructions lay out. Right? Is that right? Okay. Other Eli.
I didn't get what you just said.
That it costs me that just like. I mean, think of it in the Iraq case, that we impose sanctions on Iraq, we're losing money because our farmers can't sell stuff to Iraq, and the Iraqis are getting a cost because they can't buy this stuff. And those are, in this simplified model, we just say a $10 billion cost to me is a $10 billion cost to them. That both sides get harmed.
So, say I'm Iraq and I'm sanctioning the U.S., but it's only like 0.5. So that affects me 0.5 and the U.S. 0.5?
Yep. It's an extremely simple, oversimplified version of it, but it's some way to get at it without making it too. Again, we're going to find a lot of these problems are oversimplified, but try to get into, it's true that sanctions impose costs on both sides, so that part's accurate, and then to take it from there. Other questions? Okay, think about it. It will make sense as we play, and it should be fun.